I would. So welcome everybody to this sixth annual conference of the Cátedra and Hatherly. It's called Founding Translation Reflections upon the Process of Translating Literature. I would like to welcome our special guests, translator Karen Sodelino, Sebastião Macedo, and via Zoom, Violinda, that are going to talk about translation today. As you possibly know, Anna Hatherly, besides being a great poet and a great artist and a filmmaker, among many other things, professor, she was also a translator. And so I actually brought the book, one of the books that she translated, and I was even discussing with Karen, one of the books that she translated was published in 1974. I will give this to the Library Club Potts that is attending to this conference. Will receive this in hands. Is one of the translations that she did during the Cold War. This was published in 1974, where it happened the Carnation Revolution in Portugal, and it's a spy novel. Basically, the plot, it's a classic United States versus Russia. But she was one of the books, I think she translated at least 3 books, if I'm not mistaken. But so today is as we were saying, is about translating. I'm very, very happy and honored to have our special guests here. I would like, in name of the Center for Portuguese Studies and the Cátedra and Hatherly, to welcome everybody. I will introduce first Karen Sodelino. She graduated, she has a BA in Stanford in translation interpretation in the Associação Alumni de São Paulo, and she has a PhD in literature at UC Santa Cruz. She taught English and translation in the Associação Alumni in São Paulo, and Portuguese and translation theory in Stanford. She was a visiting scholar in Stanford and also here at UC Berkeley. And she was a guest speaker in many, many universities in Osaka, Japan, Berkeley, Stanford, Georgetown, UTAD in Trás-os-Montes, e autora em Portugal, and University of Porto. She translated Lavoura Arcaica de Radwan Nassar, Os Pobres de Raul Brandão, O Sonho da Terra de Álvaro Cadaroso Gomes, Ressurreição de Machado de Assis, and possibly we're going to talk about that as well. And one of our latest translations, Exortação dos Crocodilos, Warning to the Crocodiles of António Lobantunes. It was actually this translation that she has here that won the prize for best translation by the magazine Big Other in 2021. Thank you, Karen, for being here with us today. I'll pass to Sebastião, that holds a PhD in Hispanic languages and literatures with emphasis in Luso-Brazilian cultures and literatures from University of California in Berkeley, an MA in the Portuguese and African literatures at UFRJ, Universidade Federal do Rio de Janeiro, and is also the author of several scientific papers and articles, mainly about poetry, and translated with Brenda Hillman and Helen Hillman, At Your Feet, by Anna Cristina Cesar in 2018, correct? Yes. All right. Thank you, Sebastião, for being here today as well. And our last guest was our honorary fellow of the Center for Portuguese Studies and also the co-chair of the Cátedra, Anna Hatherly. And she was also the director of Center for Portuguese Studies for more than 20 years, Violinda Adão. She earned an MA in Hispanic Languages and Literature from the University of California in Berkeley in 2002, and a PhD in Luso-Brazilian Language and Literature also from UC Berkeley in 2007, focusing on women, gender, and sexuality. Her dissertation topic was a study of construction of feminine identity in the Portuguese literature, and she regularly publishes books, articles about women and gender, focusing, among others, on female migrants, including her latest book, As Herdeiras do Segredo. As Herdeiras do Segredo, as personagens femininas na ficção de Inês Pedrosa. She's currently translating, I think she's possibly over already, O Mestre, The Master, by Anna Hatherly. I would like to start by Belinda because the theme is the Anna Hatherly today. We'll start with Anna Hatherly and then we'll move to the translation. Well, we're talking about Anna Hatherly and translation anyway. And the first, and this is a question for the three of you. So in your last translations, which were the linguistic and cultural challenges that you faced? And could you please talk a little bit more about the original that you translated and give some examples? Belinda, I know that you had a hard time, you still have a hard time in translating the title of O Mestre. Can you please?
Well, that was the biggest not the biggest, but I think the largest meaning, because it's pivotal. As all of you, I'm sure, are aware of, translating is always a negotiation. The problem is that in Portuguese, mestre has really two meanings in English, and Anna in the text will use the word to mean both of those meanings. So the question was to use it as the master, as being someone who is teaching you, or is it going to be someone who's your mentor? So the possibility of mentor and master are there at the same time, because throughout the text, this person sort of comes in and out of being her mentor or just a master, a teacher who sometimes is and sometimes is not a mentor. So the negotiation that I came to is I haven't decided. I'm going to probably flip a coin for the title, but as far as inside the text, I've opted to, whenever the narrator is addressing the master, I am going to say master in English. And whenever the narrator is talking about the master, I will use mentor, because that seems to be an agreement of the meaning of the translation. That particular text, Anna wrote a lot more poetry than prose. So for prose are mostly essays. So this text is very poetic, is very lyrical, which means it's filled with metaphors. It's filled with something that Anna Hatherly loved, which was word games. She purposely uses words that have multiple meanings so that as to give the reader some liberty of deciding what the text is saying, depending on what meaning we are placing upon that particular word. That makes the text very difficult to translate. It looks like a simple text. They're short sentences, they're mostly affirmative. It looks simple, but it's deceitfully simple, because every word has a possibility of 3, 4, 5, 10 meanings, which has made it very labor intensive. Mm-hmm. And with an extraordinarily large number of reading, of fine-tuning it, let's say. Every time I read it, I say, oh, it's finished now. And then I read it again 2 weeks later, and I make a zillion changes. So actually, I kind of think that a translation is not finished until you send it to the printer, because then you can't change it anymore. But up until that moment, whenever I do a translation, I find myself doing that. I don't know about the other people, but mostly the problems I had to do with the multitude of meanings that and the nuances in meaning that she actually played with to convey this sort of relationship that was at one problematic but intense. So there was, and the whole sort of the flow of the relationship comes through many of these word games.
Thank you, Delina, for your, I would be in trouble as well to translate between the mentor and the master, especially by its meanings in this current moment. But anyway, I would like to ask the same question to Karen. And speaking about short sentences and long sentences, we have the last book that Karen translated, which was Warning to the Crocodiles. Karen, in your opinion, what were the challenges that you faced translating? I assume it's already difficult to read António Antunes in Portuguese. Translating into English is definitely a challenge, the whole book.
So, culturally speaking, there's the issue that the English language reader probably doesn't understand the context.
Mhm.
This novel starts out with this plane crash, the Camarate plane crash, which he doesn't, Logan Antunes does not reference explicitly,
Mhm.
but at the time that the book was published, it was fresh in people's minds.
Uh-huh.
A plane crash that kills an important politician is mentioned. And then that's kind of a nexus to these other crimes that are woven into four female voices' memories
Mhm.
of their childhood and how they got to be in the situation they're in now with their male partners. So that's a little bit of a cultural issue there for contemporary readers in English, because it's four females who are definitely in a subservient role
Mhm.
to the men. So that, for kind of the politically correct kind of literature that is popular now, that is a little bit of a problem. But I didn't worry about that in terms of translation, because these four female voices are very strong and very intelligent and very sensitive. So I personally did not consider it a problem. Then when you move into the linguistic aspects of it, Lobo Antunes also doesn't identify the voices. So we don't know for maybe 8 or 10 chapters which voice belongs to which person. So that affects register. And that affects, as Delinda was saying, in many circumstances, we have a semantic field to choose from.
Mhm.
But if we don't know who's speaking, and we haven't developed, is this a fearful person? Is this a shy person? Is this person ironic? Is this person angry? There are all of these character traits that when we're reading not as translators, we absorb at a subconscious level. But when we're translating, we have to be very aware of what these character traits are and then choose the appropriate word. So that was, that was maybe a more subtle difficulty. The obvious one is the length of the sentences.
Yeah.
And, even Raul Brandão did long sentences. So the long sentences aren't really new in Portuguese language literature. Definitely, Hatherly Nassau did the long sentences as well. So I make a choice. I like to leave them pretty long because I think that's the essence of the flow. But if I think I'm going to lose the poetic aspect, or I'm going to lose comprehension, I'll break it up. I used to use like semicolons, and with one of my Machado de Assis, the first proofreader for Cátedra, the first proofreader, who's just excellent. She said, the semicolons not well in English. And I thought to myself, she's right. They're kind of getting in the way. So I've moved away from the semicolons. So yeah, I mean, I can talk more later. But
Yeah. Thanks, Harry. Sebastian, same question for you, especially on your at your feet by Annexion, which is very different. And my next question is going to touch that. What were the cultural and linguistic aspects, which I believe were big on this particular book, that you faced in the translation?
Well, thank you for the invitation to participate in this colloquium. I'm very honored to share a table with these scholars that I admire personally. Yes, so the challenge that we found, I must say that this translation was not a long work.
Uh-huh.
It was a four hands
Four hands.
work. And Brenda Hillman and I were constantly discussing how to actually negotiate these cultural differences. And one of the things that I could point out right now is the fact that Ana Cristina in the 70s, she was writing this in the late 70s.
Mhm.
She was at the same time incorporating in the book high vocabulary with lots of erudite words or references to Western literature, etc. And at the same time, bringing pretty colloquial and street kind of language.
Mhm.
And in the process of translating, I was making some suggestions to Brenda Hillman to not only understand what the register, how the word register was operating, but we were trying also to find a form of bringing these slangs or this street language from the 70s in the United States
Mhm.
to the 70s in Brazil. And I can give you an interesting example. At some point in one of the poems, she said, I aced it in the art of knowledge. This in English, that's what we
Translated.
translated,
Mhm.
how we translated. But what she actually said in Portuguese foi something like, eu arrasei, não lembro exatamente qual é o verso, mas alguma coisa usando a palavra arrasar, verbo arrasar, which does not sound contemporary enough, right, to bring this to the 70s in Brazil. So Brenda and I were like scrambling to find forms of translating this not only
This word.
yeah, and not only the sense of what was going on, but also a kind of zeitgeist, a feel of the times. Because Ana Cristina was not just experimenting through poetry, but she was also digesting the period. I will talk
It was
little
a
more.
hard period too.
Yeah.
Right? It was like the military dictatorship in Brazil. I'm going to pass to the second question, just because it involves, and I'll keep with you, Sebastian, because that's to do with actually translating poetry. So we know that translating literary works of various genres is very different. And for instance, I assuming, as we were saying, that translating poetry is also very different from translating a novel. And could you explain how different is this process, for instance, translating, a poetry book is completely different from translating the novel. I assume there's a different research to be done. There's for sure, I don't know which one is harder, more difficult. I don't even know if it is measurable, to be honest with you. But can you explain a little bit how different is this process? I know you're translating another book of poetry. You already told me. We can talk about later, but how different it is. I can keep
think we
thinking,
can talk
or all
together.
together. Go ahead.
And Diolinda.
And Dylan as well. Karen, you want to jump
Sure.
in?
So I haven't done a lot of poetry, but actually, ironically, a colleague of mine in Brazil last week sent me a Robert Louis Stevenson poem in English and asked me to translate it into Portuguese. And I'm like, come on, you
Yeah.
gotta be kidding.
Yeah.
But it did take me back to, because I've done very little, so I don't want to say too much about this, but I feel like differently from prose, it's like you're also kind of doing a puzzle in a way, because you are more aware, right, of the number of words you're using and how they rhyme or don't rhyme. So we don't have that so much in prose. So that's really all I can say, because I haven't done a lot. I've done Lego Evil and then a few random Sacanero. I've done a few, but it's more of a, for me, that's what I feel is the difference. I have more that quebra-cabeça idea that I don't get with prose so much. So you should talk about this.
Well, I was going to go on this direction. I'll talk briefly to allow Diolinda also to speak. But I think the same way, Karen. The process of translating poetry must be sort of, you have to magnify the text and see exactly not only the word that you are translating, but the words that are around, the question of the metrics, the rhythm,
the sound.
and also the speciality of the text in the page. So there's lots of things that, sort of like puts you on a kind of grid, and it's kind of difficult to move around and play too much. There is a sense of puzzle, but I think that one of the big challenges for translators of poetry is actually being able to understand what kind of options you have when you don't have a translatable sentence, or when you don't have expression that corresponds to what you're translating, and then you have to make choices that will not match with what you have in the original. And that is a big challenge, because you end up not only doing what Karen mentioned, that is, you have to interpret what you're doing, but you have to kind of recreate to a certain extent.
So let me pick your words and launch ask the question to Yolanda. Same question, Yolanda, but I would like to add, do you think that at this point, poetry books should be translated only by poets and not the common translator? Yolanda, I want to jump on this.
I'm not sure.
Okay.
I go back and forth with that thought.
Trying to be polemic.
But I don't think that
Translating
only
poetry.
poets. I don't think only poets can translate poetry. I don't think that. Actually, I think it may be a little bit dangerous, because being that poets are so close to that literary production, the temptation of creating a new piece that that is sort of laid out in the piece you're translating can be too great. I think what both Karen and Sebastian said was that we're talking about negotiation. Translation is always a series of negotiations. It's just that there are more pieces in the puzzle of that negotiation when you're translating poetry. I'm just going to give you my example. When I have two preoccupations when I translate. My first and foremost, I'm very concerned about keeping the author's voice. Most authors, after you read 3 or 4 or 5 books by them, you can almost hear them in your head. There's a specific voice that it's particular to each author. And I believe that is also present in poetry, but nonetheless, so I'm very concerned about making sure that text remains the author's text. And then the second thing that I worry about is I try to base my translation so that when the English reader reads that piece of literature, that person is having the same emotional impact or the same emotional reaction. He's basically getting the same message as the reader in the original language, because I feel that's very important. Well, those two things hold true to poetry, of course, but now you have to worry about all the things that Sebastian talked about it, the metric, the rhyme, especially in poems that have very strict rules, like sonnets, for instance. They're a nightmare because things fall apart in another language. So what do you compromise? What do you go for? Do you make actual meaning be the most important? Do you make the metric the most important? Do you make the rhyme? What is the one thing that's going, when it's time to decide, I choose A, B, or C, what's going to make you make that decision? And that it needs to be consistent. So I think this is why I agree translating poetry is very difficult because there are just too many pieces in the puzzle.
Mhm. Mhm. Thanks, Belinda. I'll pass to the next question for Karen. And this is related also to the question I have after. Sebastian already talked a little bit on his book, but what are the specificities of translating from Portuguese to English? So we're talking about the Romance language, Portuguese. What kind of specifics, you can give examples? You have some of, and we're talking about not linguistically, but also culturally.
Well, linguistically, we have the implicit subject in Portuguese.
Uh-huh.
And so, and writers, literary writers, they really use that. You as native readers are probably not aware of how well they use that implicit subject, which can create
Mhm.
it can be a way of foreshadowing.
Yeah.
And, and clunk, here I come in English and I have to make that subject explicit. And that is true for almost every writer
Mhm.
that I have worked on. So that is a big one. Another one that's kind of generic, but maybe a tiny bit more in Portugal is what I would consider extraneous information,
Mhm.
like such as he hung up his hat, but first he removed it from his head. So we can just say he hung up his hat because we know.
It's pleonastic, right? It
Yeah,
doesn't-
yeah. So there'll be times when I will even only catch that when I'm revising,
Mhm.
because I'll be looking at it in English and I'll say, oh, well, wait a minute. I don't, that piece of information in that circumstance doesn't need to be there. So that's kind of a general thing, more with some authors, less.
And
with
so
some.
you would erase anyway. this
Not
type of
always,
information?
not
Not
always,
always.
but sometimes it can work, but if it sounds when it borders on the comical,
Uh-huh.
then the last one that I did was just recent in, it was in Lobo and Tunis, I think. No, anyway, I'll remember in a minute who it was, but, no, it was Machado de Assis, and it was, he reached out and touched his daughter, but first he moved his arm. So, I mean, it was, so when you read that in English, it's like, okay, it
Makes no sense.
It makes no sense, and also you have to be aware, and probably Sebastian and Delinda, you don't want to make it look like you made a mistake. As the translator, like, why did she include this kind of a thing? So, but sometimes it's okay to leave it. So I wouldn't say I just go erase that every time.
What about gender? Because, how do you?
It can be, especially if it comes up with ocean. And because sometimes you want to say, oh, a terra, those are the big ones that comes up. A terra, maybe even more then they'll reference a terra and then they'll say, iela. And sometimes depending if it's a poetic text with terra or with country, I will use this she, if it'll work. That again is the kind of thing I catch later when I read it. When I review and I'm like, is that working? There was one where it was a morte acompanhando os personagens no elevador. And then be like, they don't know, but she's always there. They don't know, but she's always there. And actually, I left it. I did it because it worked. I mean, but I won't know until after a while, after I separated myself from the text. So yeah, the gender is an implicit subject, people, I'm telling you.
It's terrible, right?
And the indeterminate set also is tricky because a lot of translators.
You have to put a subject.
You have to put a subject, and a lot of translators, when they don't have experience, they'll immediately use one. And one can always buy more apples, or one doesn't like to go to the beach when it's cold. Well, that's a very formal register. So it doesn't work in a lot of circumstances. So those are constant. I mean, I'm sure you've experienced. So,
yeah. Well, I have a same experience that Karen described. We had a lot of trouble translating Ana Cristina César because of the implicit subject.
Uh-huh.
And also Ana Cristina says a plays with, the simplicity to disguise the difficulty of expressing her bisexuality.
Uh-huh.
So it was a big challenge to, at the same time, be faithful to the original, but
Uh-huh.
not conceal the effort to bring the possibility of being read as this is either valid to men and women.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
So it was a big challenge. But I would, that I think is also interesting to regard when it comes to translating from Portuguese into English all the way around, that is the expressions, the idioms. There is one example that I find delicious in Ana Cristina César's work. That is, there's a moment in the first poem that she says, um, uh, como é que se diz isso?
You can say in Portuguese.
No, I want to remember how it's in Portuguese. I don't
Okay,
remember.
oh,
I'm
you
just
have
thinking
the
in English right
yeah.
now. It's like, what she says in Portuguese is, estamos em cima da hora. That's the
Right.
verse, right? And how we would say that in Portuguese, right? Like we can't say that we are on the top of the hour or something like that. It would make no sense, or so we end up having the decision that had nothing to do with the sense of estamos em cima da hora. We decide to translate as we're running out of time, which
Or
does
it's
not.
time.
It's like just to create a sense of you, like,
The meaning, right?
yeah,
To
that
under the meaning.
there's an urge to get something done or move forward somehow,
Mhm.
but doesn't have the sense that you are, on the very last second. We couldn't,
You can
convey
under
that aspect.
Mhm.
So it's very tricky to translate idioms.
Yeah. Yolinda, you want to
Well,
add?
I agree with, again, of course, with everything that was said. Idiomatic expressions are a huge problem, as is gender. But the problem with both is they are culturally bound. And that is what we're talking about, is how do we translate some terms or even even actions that make perfect sense for the original text and in the Portuguese world, be it Portugal's or Brazil's, but are not, they don't make sense. And I'm thinking of one in Gente Feliz com Lágrimas, which was the mother's ritual about o Dia dos Finados. And it's just not as much of a ritual. So the whole ritual sounds almost silly. And it becomes very difficult when we're trying to transpose a description of activities that are very culturally bound and don't happen in English speaking countries per se. That becomes a difficulty. Often described to when we're translating interaction between parents and children or even siblings, because those relationships, the dynamics of those relationships are different in both of these cultures. And sometimes beijou o seu pai calorosamente, it's going to be a problem. People are in English is, he kissed his father full-heartedly or whatever. It just we need to make adjustments for cultural relationships and cultural activities. And I think both gender and, of course, the idiomatic expressions fall under that category, but there's so much more. Gente Feliz com Lágrimas, which is happy people with tears, which I co-translated with another person, was a nightmare, because it's filled with not only Portuguese idiomatic expressions and also idiomatic expressions particular to the island of São Miguel and the Azores and to the countryside, not the city, and filled with things that have to do with agriculture and with terms that are not standard in standard Portuguese. Half of the time, we didn't even know what these people were doing. It took a lot of research to even figure out what was he saying in Portuguese. So those could be a problem. And I'm sure both of your illustrious panelists have come up with those little events.
Antonio, and Diolinda, or A.T. Claire.
I would like to move forward to a more, let's say, practical in a way, or more a little bit outside the world of translation, but still in the world of translation. And I would like to remember here an episode also with Karen, and we're last week having lunch with Carlos Page here, and we're talking about the word cansadot and how difficult it would be to translate essa queiroz today, and why cansadot, like
Cansadote. Ele
cansadot.
está cansadote.
Oh, okay,
Cansadot.
okay.
So, and this brings me to what I think it's one of the problems, like why, I don't know if it's related to this, but we, Portuguese language, and when I say Portuguese, I'm talking about like culturally speaking, like Brazil, Angola, Mozambique, Portugal, Guinea-Bissau, Saint May. I would like, why don't we have such a rich literature in Portuguese language? Why doesn't exist more translations of Portuguese in the Anglophone world?
Antonio, and
What is your opinion, Karen? Why is such a, like when you compare it to other languages, Portuguese is so
Rich, and the literature is so rich. I years and years and years ago, I asked an editor from Companhia das Letras, which is a huge publishing house. And this was when I was trying to place Lavoura Arcaica, which is such an important book in Brazil. And I was getting very frustrated. And she said, bom, Karen, daí une-se o desinteresse com a ignorância, e é fatal. So she said, the problem is we have a lack of interest combined with ignorance.
that's a big one, right?
It's a really serious combination when you're trying. And I mean, I laugh now. At the time, I didn't think it was funny because it's also exaggerating. There are a lot of people who are very interested, and she did acknowledge it. She said, the problem is that you get one person in one publishing house very motivated, and then they move on or they retire, and then you have to cultivate these other relationships.
Mhm.
But I mean, I have to say, to this day, for me, it is still a mystery. I think we've also moved into a period of time where there's a certain type of literature that companies want, that publishing houses want, that are dealing with these sociological themes that are very important. No, deixam de ser. They are important themes, but meaning gender and race and oppression. But
So do you think, for instance, let me just interrupt. Do you think, for instance, essa queiroz and Machado, would not, let's say, interest today's readers?
today's readers aren't really reading Henry James or Edith Wharton. They're sadly, they're not. But I mean, nonetheless, I'm trying to place a very, in some ways, traditional author, but I've seen that placing her more cutting edge, which she is.
Mhm.
I think it's the different markets. I think we're going to come out of this period that we're in right now, where these publishers are in such a panic trying to publish very contemporary. Even one publisher, it told me when he read, I was seeing that, he said, this is beautiful, but we're trying to do more cutting edge things right now. Yeah. So I don't know what do you think?
What do you think?
I don't know. I think Machado is pretty cutting edge, but that's okay. Yeah. Again, the market does dictate what people are going to read. I am very concerned, and most of my decision-making process as far as translation has also been that what can we in use to teach. There is a very, I've taught for years. I've taught a course of Portuguese lit in translation, and I've had to do a lot of translation in order to be able to teach that course. Because you cannot teach a panoramic Portuguese literature course of either Brazilian literature, Portuguese literature, and even worse, African or Lusophone in translation, because we just do not have sufficient translations of iconic and of works and authors that are absolutely indispensable for the continuity of that panoramic view of the literary development, let's say, or the literary history of the space we're talking about. So to me, there's also that concern. It's just not the concern about what is selling. And of course, the publishers only want to pay translations that are going to sell. And then they're looking for cutting edge things that we really are probably not going to be using extensively in our classes, or if we want to teach one of these courses. And I personally feel it's important that the time it takes for a student to learn a language like Portuguese well enough to read Fernando Pessoa, or to read some of, well, Fernando Pessoa, there's a lot translated, but nonetheless, to read Agostina Bessa Luís, who is important.
For instance, let me just, Linda, can I interrupt
so
you?
it's important for us to do that, and that's almost a labor of love, because that has no publishing interest to speak of.
So, in your opinion, for instance, were you saying a short story by Machado de Assis or a short story by Essa would not collect the interest in this case?
Well,
go ahead.
I'm not saying that. I think that perhaps it would be easier for a publisher to think of the possibility of an anthology of short stories, which would include these authors. That may be more appealing or more interesting to a publisher, than just Machado's short stories or just Essa's short stories. Because again, it's not cutting edge for today's reader. Today's reader is not used to reading very long, drawn out sentences. They're used, it's a choppier sort of writing almost. And even in Portugal, people are doing that. We have some contemporary writers in Portugal who, if you look at their works, they are much more, they read with much more ease and short sentences and mostly affirmative and etc.
Easier to sell, basically. That's what
Yeah, I'm not sure if those are the works that they may sell, but are those that are going to give is that what's going to bring Portuguese, I'm not going to say Portuguese, but literature written in the Portuguese language to the world market? Is that the right option? But of course, we don't make those options. Those options are made by publishers. But at some point, publishers were students. So we, who are in higher education, our responsibility is to provide good information so that these future publishers can make sound decisions or better decisions. I'm not sure that Essa or Machado were ever for the general public, even in their own countries. I am sure that given the level of irony that both of these authors used, many of the readers, their readers in their own language, didn't really understand what they were reading. So because I find both of them to be very contemporary. We can look at some of those works, and we're facing those exact same problems. So
why, sorry, Dylan, what do you think, why not more Portuguese translations into English in this Anglophone world? Because we have such a rich literature.
I would say that there is an issue of the protagonism of the countries that speak Portuguese that may have, I'm not going to say like strongly, but may have not been, in great protagonism in the global stage. So it's possible that this is also a piece in this puzzle. I think that's connected also with something that Karen mentioned, that it has to do with some sort of appeal that specific forms of representation in literature are interesting for the market, for the reader. But also I think that there is this issue of global politics, protagonism, etc. I will give you an example. In 2017, I think, Brazil was the featured country in the book fair in Frankfurt. And majority of the authors were educated, urban, white people writing about educated white people. Example, Bernardo de Carvalho, Milton Ratum, etc. What's his name? Luis Rufato, etc. With few exceptions, right? So you have this. Today, in the United States, there are a number of publications coming from activists, people of color, people of faith, indigenous people. It has everything to do with this international appeal to hear what is being discussed and thought and experienced through these identities.
So you think we're being too much monothematic is what you're like, are we just
no, I don't
specific
I don't think it turns
monothematic, when I say monothematic, not
monothematic.
one thing. I'm saying.
No, I don't think that it comes to, to sort of filter in one thing, because although you may have a kind of collective identity on these authors, all of them had different approaches and experiences, etc. But I still think that there is an issue related with the fact that global presence, global protagonism, I'm insisting this word, is an important factor. And recently, I have seen translations of Machado de Assis and Graciliano Ramos into English that are difficult to read to the common American reader, but nevertheless had made, to the New York Book Review of Books. Yeah, so it's tricky to, sort of be a little strict with this perception. I'm not sure.
Thanks for your answers. Before we pass to I invite the people attending on Zoom to put ask their questions via chat. We're approaching to the end of our event. Before I do a last question to our special guests, I would like to remember that on November 16, our librarian for Romance languages, Paul Potts, is showcasing a micro collection of Anna Hatherly. I still have to give this translation from the book of Robert Little by Anna Hatherly to Claude, but all is invited. I'll follow up also with an email to those that are present today about this showcase of the micro collection of Anna Hatherly here at UC Berkeley. I would like to make a last question for the three of you, but in special, especially also for Karen. And what are the current challenges and we can talk about this before, current challenges translators face today? The things change quite a bit in the past decades, I want to say.
I think things have changed a lot, and I think for younger translators who are just starting out, the real positive thing is that they have many different choices of where they can get their work published, because so much happens online. And some of these magazines, and blogs are very respected and they're refereed. And so that's exciting, because when I was starting out, it was snail mail, writing and saying, are you interested? And, you'd actually send papers and all of that. On the other hand, because there are so many translators now, people in academia, not you two, for sure. I don't, I'm not kidding.
Let's be
I don't want
polemic
you.
anyway.
but-
Let's be polemic now.
But during the last, say, 20 years, young academics have figured out that a translation is kind of a niche, and it's a way that they can publish. So you can, and I don't know if Linda has come across this or not, or Sebastian is so young, he wouldn't, but sometimes you can almost tell when the person doesn't have that real passion of a translator or literature, but they're kind of using it as a way to
As
get
a
more
staff.
stuff published. That's a small issue, but it does exist. But the thing that you and I talked about the other day is it's kind of every man for himself. And in my way of thinking, if you're a literary translator, you're not really good at self-promotion, because you're spending most of your time with
Doing your job.
books and doing your blog
Yeah.
and your thesaurus, and then you're reading other sources and you're reading, other literature. The period, it involves a lot of time by yourself. And usually we're not that great at self-promotion, although, there are some people who are, and they're doing better because they write those emails and they have a blog, and so that's a really big change that you can, what day, sometimes I see it as a positive thing, and sometimes I'm like,
Yeah, it's definitely a challenge.
yeah.
Dealing the same, I don't know if you
Yeah, I'm done. I'm
finished
good.
it.
I'm good.
What do you want
So I think one of the problems is being paid adequately. It is,
to? That's pretty much every job in humanities, dealing then. So,
well, but it goes beyond that. It's almost expected that there's this kind of notion that translation is, if you know that both languages, this shouldn't be a major problem. And there's a generalized lack of awareness of, even by people who should be aware of this, of the enormous amount of research that goes into an adequate translation, a translation that is thoughtful. And I think that is the people think you can just write in one language and it goes through your head as though it was some sort of copying machine, and it just comes out the other end in another language. It's a lot more involved in that. So that being said, I think people just expect that it should be not paid as a work of art, not paid, but just they view translators as sort of being bona fide clerks more so than a trained professional who is actually recreating a work of art in a way. So that to me is problematic.
Sebastian, same question. And you are a specific field as well, translating poetry. What are the current challenges that the translator face today? Was it easy, for instance, to find a publishing house to translate poetry?
No, it's very difficult.
Let's start with that.
In the United States in particular, because as you all may know very well, poetry tends to be published in chapbooks, not books. And that's a big challenge, because Ana Cristina's book could come as a chapbook. But in the process of negotiating with Companhia das Letras, by the way, the same big press house, we had so much challenge, and they had many sort of requirements
Uh-huh.
for allowing us to publish.
That's another.
Yeah, which was very difficult, and
Are we
it-
talking about copyright? or-
Copyright,
Copyright.
permission,
Yeah, that's a
right?
big-
And one of the things that they had, they shared with us is like a kind of, real strong requirement to publish in a specific format.
Mhm.
They want a bilingual page, like mirrored
Mhm.
translation page, the same page,
Mhm.
two languages, etc. So it couldn't come in a sort of alternative format. It had,
That one.
yeah, based on the, decisions or requirements that not only Companhia das Letras, but the family, the heirs of, Maxima Congo
Uh-huh.
had put up.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it was a big challenge.
Dylan, you want to conclude? We've run out of time. I would like to thank our guest speakers, Karen, Belinda, and Sebastian, for this wonderful moment. We have a lot of things to discuss. I would like also to thank Instituto Camões for supporting here this conference, and also to FLAD, allow us to do this conference as well. I invite you then on November 16th to be present at the Doe Library to see the showcase of the microworks of the micro collection, not microworks. She had amazing big works as well of Anna Hatherly here at UC Berkeley. And I'll pass this again, this translation of Anna Hatherly to Bob Potts, and possibly will be able also to showcase this original. Once again, thank you so much, Karen,
Thank you.
Sebastian,
Thank you.
and Yelena
Thank
from
you.
home. And see you soon an event for the Center for Portuguese Studies. Thank you.
Thank you and have a great day.
Thanks.
Thank
You
you.
too.
Take care.
Take care.
Take care.